Hello, my name is Mario Rusinov and I am one of the co-authors of the study on election fraud during the parliamentary elections in October 2022. The project is supported by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation under the Rule of Law Program Southeast Europe. I have here with me Dr. Nikola Tulechki and Dr. Petar Cholakov. As you may know, we are doing this study since last year, when we looked at electoral data for the period 2013-2021, with the goal of creating a working statistical model to help us identify polling stations at risk of vote purchasing and manipulation. The goal of this project is to empower civil society and also to inform enforcement agencies so they could work on prevention and so they have sound analytical data. I believe studies such as this one are very important because vote manipulation is a systemic issue in Bulgaria. It undermines the legitimacy of our institutions and also the trust in the electoral process. I hope our work will help restore public trust in the electoral process and reduce vote purchasing and manipulation. Now I give the floor to Dr. Petar Cholakov. Thank you, Mario. I'm grateful to the ACF for the invite to write the foreword to this important study. Indeed, the problem with vote purchasing and manipulation in Bulgaria is unfortunately systemic. Surely this happens elsewhere in the world, including in well-established democracies. However, in Bulgaria, despite our country being a member of the European Union, the situation is particularly grave. We have been observing this issue for more than 30 years. As this study shows, certain political parties regularly use unfair strategies and tactics to gain representation within the Bulgarian National Assembly. Our suspicions about this are based on data from a number of studies, including this study by the ACF. In this regard, one of the parties that I would like to highlight is the Movement for Rights and Freedoms. The data from the ACF study shows that, if I remember correctly, around 42% of all votes at risk in Bulgaria have been cast for the Movement for Rights and Freedoms. This is a very worrying sign. Now, allow me to provide some context about the situation in Bulgaria. It is well known that ethnic minorities, including the Roma minority, are the main target for the persons who engage in vote purchasing and manipulation. Poor people, those with relatively low education, and this includes ethnic Bulgarians as well, are typically those who are targeted. Oftentimes, there are discussions in the media about the cost of selling one's vote. However, such discussions omit one very important issue, and this is the fact that many of the Roma are facing issues with debt bondage. These people owe a lot of money to loan sharks who are working together with organized crime. Unfortunately, the business of vote purchasing and manipulation is quite lucrative. And I believe this is a business that is protected or maybe even actively supported by political figures, by magistrates, by members of the police force, etc. And some of these people have a vested interest in the situation continuing as is. So these members of the Roma minority who are facing grave financial problems have some of their debt reduced in exchange for effectively selling their votes. I mentioned already that this study by the ACF is very important. This is because if we expect that the usual suspects, the parties which are regularly engaged in vote manipulation, parties such as GERB, the Bulgarian Socialist Party, and the movement for rights and freedoms. If we expect that these parties will act like the Baron Münchhausen and pull themselves out of the swamp, we will be disappointed. This won't happen. So what we need to do is to inform civil society, to sound the alarm, to inform the media. Personally, I do this regularly. I refer the ACF study and its findings, and I believe the only way to change the situation in Bulgaria is by informing citizens so that they start believing that actually their actions matter. Now I give the floor to Dr. Nikola Tulechki, who will tell us more about the methodology behind the study. Nikola, you have the floor. Hello. I will tell you more about the study and the methodological basis of the study. We have used open data provided by the Central Electoral Commission, and more specifically, we used the digital versions of the protocols published by local polling stations. Since 2011, these protocols have to be published as per EU directive on the reuse of public sector information. Our survey focuses on the period 2013-2021. What we did first was to analyze famous cases of vote purchasing and manipulation. We gathered the information about these cases from the media, from police reports, or reports by various NGOs. Even if there were no legal consequences for the perpetrators in many of these cases, such cases do leave a footprint in the data. So this allowed us to look at the protocols by the relevant polling stations and create a statistical footprint of vote purchasing and manipulation. Once we created the footprint, we were able to apply it on new data. Through our work on this study, we have helped to improve the way the Central Electoral Commission, via the company information services, publishes electoral data. There were several issues with the way data was published. One main issue was the fact that the addresses of polling stations were not mentioned. Since 2022, this has happened upon our insistence. Other issues remain, though. For example, there is no unified standard for the publication of data. Each time the data is published in a slightly different format, which makes analyzing it more difficult. Another major issue is that it is not possible to identify specific candidates through various rounds of elections. For example, people with common last names or women who may marry or change their last name, it's not possible to know if it's their first time or they have been candidates before. Now, allow me to give you an example of the statistical footprint of vote purchasing and manipulation. We have here 4 graphs from Sofia showing electoral results for the period 2013-2022. The graphs represent 4 different neighborhoods: Oborište, Mladost 1, Lulin 4 and Hristo Botev, where there is a compact Roma population. If we compare these graphs, we do not have to be data scientists to notice that there is one which is quite different than the rest. 3 of the graphs, for Oborište, Mladost and Lulin, look pretty similar, even though the demographics of the residents of these neighborhoods are diverse. However, in the Hristo Botev neighborhood, we can observe several very interesting phenomena. Firstly, voter turnout levels vary greatly. For example, in 2013, less than 1,000 people voted. In April 2021, more than 3,500 people voted. Several months later, in July, only 650 people voted. This is really a significant drop within only a few months. Another phenomenon is the significant volatility of the vote. I have marked with red the results from the local elections from 2019, where we can see one anomaly. The large majority cast their votes for the candidate by the GERB party in light blue in the graph. Within the same round of elections, a large majority supported the movement for rights and freedoms for the municipal council. This kind of anomaly suggests that there were suspicious electoral practices in this neighborhood. Now let me show you how we have turned this footprint into a statistical model. We use several statistical models. The first one is multi-component abnormal behavior. We look at sections with unusually high number of votes for winning parties compared to the average for the municipality. We also look at sections with unusually high voter turnout in comparison to the average. Until recently, we were looking at sections with abnormally high numbers of invalid ballots, as this is an important indicator for questionable practices. Following the introduction of voting machines, we no longer had to look at this indicator during the last round of elections, but considering the current political situation, we're worried that we may have to start looking at this variable again. Now, the second model looks on the deviations in voter turnout. So here we track elections chronologically and check if there are polling stations with very high turnout during one round and then very low turnout during the next and vice versa. The third model focuses on the volatility in the political preferences. So, for example, the majority of people vote for one party during one round of elections and then they completely change their preferences during the next. Typically, people's political preferences are relatively stable, so we are looking for examples where the data shows a different pattern. Considering that we are working with statistical models, we have come up with two thresholds, the low outlier threshold and the high outlier threshold. This gives us a margin of error, and we know that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Since this year, we also studied the preferential votes based on several variables. Firstly, sections with unusually high concentration of preferential votes. For example, more than 85% of the preferences for a party given for one particular candidate. We also look at the dispersion, which is a mathematical variable showing the way random variables are distributed relative to the mean. What this means in our case is that typically preferences are evenly distributed within an electoral district. Surely this is never 100% so. A candidate may be more popular in their hometown in comparison to other towns in the district. But what if there is a high concentration of preferential votes in only 5 or 6 polling stations? This is highly unusual, and the variable of dispersion allows us to observe such anomalies in the number of preferences for candidates. We also use the same metric with regards to political parties. Now let me tell you a couple of words about the structure of the report. It has two parts. The first part focuses on the polling stations at sustained high risk of vote purchasing and manipulation, a total of 1,738 stations. These includes polling stations deemed high risk under the high outlier threshold by at least two of the models I showed you earlier. The first part of the analysis focuses on these sections. In the second part, we have applied our method to the data from October 2022, identifying new polling stations at risk. Now I give the floor to Mario to tell you more about our findings. I have the honor of presenting the findings of our analysis. I won't go into too much detail. You can read the report and find all the data there. The report is available on our website. What have we noticed so far? Well, there seems to be a slight increase in voter turnout in polling stations at risk. However, if we put this into context, we will see that the October turnout is lower than the turnout from July 2021 and a little bit higher than voter turnout in November 2021. Looking at this data chronologically, though, we will notice that in March 2017, a total of 354,000 votes were cast at polling stations at risk. In April 2021, we also see a relatively high number, with 318,000 votes cast at polling stations at risk. So we see that for the period from July 2021 to November 2021 and to the last round of elections, a relative equilibrium has been reached. How can we comment on these findings? Well, one of the possible explanations we have is that the political parties are more prone to using illegal means during important moments. For example, if we look at the data from 2017, we will see that the Movement for Rights and Freedoms got the majority of votes at polling stations at risk. At that time, changes in the electoral law had limited voting in Turkey, which is where the Movement for Rights and Freedoms traditionally gets a lot of electoral support. So we can surmise that the party used manipulative tactics to make up for votes that they have lost from Turkey. If we look at the elections in April 2021, then we see that the majority of votes cast at polling stations at risk were given to the GERB political party. If I am to remind you of the political context, back then there was serious competition about the first place in the elections, and it was very important that GERB score a strong victory. So this is one explanation why we observed the higher voter turnout and more votes for them cast in polling stations at risk. Namely, they tried to secure the first place by using such means. Of course, this is just one possible explanation. Now let us take a look at the results of political parties in the polling stations at risk in July 2021, November 2021 and October this year. Turnout dropped in July, then dropped even further in November, but in the last round of elections, when there was a possibility for these parties to actually form a government, there was an increase in the number of votes for them. At the same time, if you look at the results of the Bulgarian Socialist Party, you will notice a declining trend compared to 2017. The number of votes for the Bulgarian Socialist Party cast in polling stations at risk dropped significantly between 2017 and October 2022. This decrease is asymmetrical. I mean, it's not possible to explain it by an overall reduction in the number of votes for the Socialist Party on the national level. So perhaps this is an indicator that actually these are votes at risk that the Bulgarian Socialist Party has lost. At the same time, if we look at the data for We Continue the Change or Democratic Bulgaria, including also the number of votes for the Возраждане Party, we see that their results at polling stations at risk are fairly similar to their results on the national level. There's a relative stability in terms of the results. With regards to Възраждане, we see a 100% increase in the number of votes, but they also have the same increase throughout the country. Now let me show you how the share of the votes cast in stations at risk compared to all votes in the country looks like in the different multi-mandate polling districts. The largest share has been registered in Kırjali, followed by Burgas and Blagoevgrad. There is also a serious problem in Haskovo. The issue is less prevalent in Sofia and in Kırjali, in Küstendil. Now I will show you the share of votes cast in stations at risk of all votes in the multi-mandate polling district. We see the largest share in Kırjali, Dobrich, Montana, Vidin and Târgoviște. In terms of the results of political parties from polling stations at risk, the top three include the Movement for Rights and Freedoms with 42% of all votes cast at polling stations at risk. They are followed by GERB. In both cases, there is an increase in the number of votes which is asymmetrical to the results on the national level. Both parties received more support on the national level as well. However, for GERB, national level support was up by 0.5%, while support from polling stations at risk increased by 2%. If we look at the data for the movement for rights and freedoms, during the November round of elections, they received 341,000 votes. In October, they received 344,000 votes. So this means a 3% increase within polling stations at risk. Again, this is an asymmetrical increase, and it cannot be explained by increased level of trust in the party. We continue the change, are third in polling stations at risk. Their result dropped slightly in October 2022 compared to November last year. They had around 10% of the vote in polling stations at risk in November, and they achieved 9% in October this year. We need to make a disclaimer here that there are certain limitations to our methodology. The statistical models allow us to track polling stations at risk. We cannot, however, say with certainty what portion of the votes cast at these polling stations have actually been manipulated. It could be 100%, it could be less. The examples that we have given in the analysis show that voter turnout is typically very low at polling stations at risk unless there is a reward or some sort of threat. Most likely, the results which we see when voter turnout is low represent authentic votes, whereas the highly volatile vote and large discrepancies in turnout between different election rounds suggest purchased on manipulated votes. Another thing that we must make clear. We're analyzing these polling stations because we believe they should be monitored based on the data. However, there could be instances of vote purchasing and manipulation in other polling stations. The violations could happen once or more than once. This means that we need to apply our model to the data for each new round of elections in order to identify new polling stations at risk. So what happened when we applied our methodology on the results for this year, which are the newly identified polling stations at risk? If we apply the low outlier threshold, we see that 193,000 people cast their votes at polling stations at risk in October compared to 130 people in November 2021. If we apply the high outlier threshold, we see that 126,000 people voted in polling stations at risk in October compared to 89,000 people last year. Now let us review the data on the share of vote purchasing and manipulation within the different multi-mandate polling districts. The biggest problems seem to be in Pazardzhik, and this is the case for the second time in a row. The share of manipulated votes has also increased in Blagoevgrad, Haskovo, Varna, and in Stara Zagora. On the municipal level, we see some very interesting things emerge. We have mentioned some municipalities with particularly high risk of vote manipulation in our analysis. Municipalities like Gurkovo, Hayredin, and Metrovets. Allow me, though, to focus on one municipality called Bratia Daskalovi. This will really help us to explain what polling stations at risk look like and what kinds of voter behavior can be observed there. Based on the data, the Movement for Rights and Freedoms gained 620 votes in the municipality, and they were the electoral winner there. We also have the data from November last year. What are the results? Well, actually, in October, compared to November last year, there was a threefold increase in the number of votes for the Movement for Rights and Freedoms. There is also great volatility in terms of voter preferences in this municipality throughout the years. For example, in the elections in November 2021, the winner was the GERB party. Now it was the Movement for Rights and Freedoms. In July 2021, the winner was the Bulgarian Socialist Party. This is an example of a great level of volatility which cannot be explained by any objective facts, or at least we cannot explain it by such facts. I would also like to show you which parties received the most support at polling stations at risk during this round of elections. 38% of voters in polling stations at risk cast their votes for the Movement for Rights and Freedoms, 24% for GERB, 10% for We Continue the Change, 9% for the Bulgarian Socialist Party, 5% for Возраждане, Bulgarian Revival and Democratic Bulgaria each received 2% of the votes. These results are very similar to the results from the polling stations at sustained risk identified previously by our study. One thing that we can see clearly is that voting patterns look similar in all these polling stations. This clearly shows that, firstly, our methodology is working. Secondly, it shows that this is how manipulated and purchased voting looks like. Allow me to tell you more about our methodology for identifying polling stations at risk based on party preferences. What we did first when we were working on this model was to calculate the normal distribution of preferences. This was based on the premise that political party supporters behave differently in terms of their willingness to mark their preferences for particular party candidates on the ballot. Indeed, some parties encourage this practice, and in the case of Democratic Bulgaria, 1 in 2 of their voters marked preferences on the ballot. In contrast, parties like There Is Such a People do not encourage this kind of voting. The same applies to the Movement for Rights and Freedoms. So we calculated how many preferences have been cast during this round of elections. We also calculated the dispersion, and this showed us where was the largest concentration of preferences. What did we notice? Despite the fact that the voters of Democratic Bulgaria are the most active when it comes to marking preferences, and the voters of the Movement for Rights and Freedoms the least active, only 1 in 5 of all of their voters cast a preference, the Movement for Rights and Freedoms has the second largest concentration of preferences, which is strange. The winner in terms of this variable is the GERB party. We identified 144 polling stations where over 85% of the votes for a particular party also mentioned preferences for one particular candidate. The largest concentration of preferences was recorded in the municipality of Simitli. You can actually watch videos showing witnesses, people who were members of the local electoral committees, and 3 of those videos show people who were based in Simitli, telling that there had been many violations of the electoral procedures there. There had also been illegal campaigning activity during the electoral day by one particular candidate. This candidate was also the person with the second highest concentration of preferences. His name is Stefan Apostolov. One of our conclusions is that the manipulated vote has many faces. It is possible to exercise hard and soft forms of control. Very often, in small towns, the local administration is the source of this electoral manipulation, and they exercise forms of soft control, such as buying people treats just before the elections, or using persuasion, or giving prime positions to the promotional materials of one party and removing the materials of other parties. This is a type of electoral pressure which should be studied further. So going back to the data, with regards to the municipalities with the largest concentration of preferences, these municipalities are Simitli, Ihtiman, Kresna and Samokov. In terms of the preferences per party, GERB received 8,800 votes from polling stations with large concentrations of preferences. The Bulgarian Socialist Party received 2,200 votes. The Movement for Rights and Freedoms, 1,800 votes. Democratic Bulgaria received 560 votes. The rest of the data is available on our website. This sums up our main findings. I would like to conclude on a relatively positive note. We always provide our findings and analysis to enforcement agencies, and during the last few rounds of elections, we witnessed enthusiasm on their part. We have also seen actions taken by the enforcement agencies. Indeed, the problem with the purchased and manipulated vote should be dealt with. Along with the efforts such as police presence during the elections day, preventive steps should also be taken. These include educating voters and helping to improve the living standards of marginalized groups who are most targeted by actors seeking to manipulate the election results. Besides the short-term measures which we are seeing, there is also a need for long-term measures. We're happy to offer our help in this regard. Thank you for your attention.